This video is sponsored by the American Crisis, War in the North. Check out their Kickstarter via the link in the description, or at www.yourdadwilllovethis.com. Also, this video is a companion to our two-part series on the history of libertarianism. You can check it out by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. While this video totally works on its own, knowing the history of libertarianism will add useful context. The year is 1688, and the Glorious Revolution has ended in the deposition of England's King James II and the installation of its new co-monarchs, William III and his wife, Mary II. But new rulers meant new problems. This was the age of divine right, a time when kings were chosen by God to rule their subjects. You can think what you want about this justification today, but at the time of the Glorious Revolution, it was rock solid. God was definitely real, he was definitely all-powerful, and he definitely appointed kings. And yet, here the English people were, deposing their God-chosen king. In doing so, they were declaring that God was wrong, and by replacing him, they were saying that they knew better. Unfortunately, neither of those ideas make any sense. It's not metaphysically possible for God to be wrong. As an all-knowing and all-powerful being, God defines right and wrong. But the English people really hated their old sovereign, and really liked these new ones. Something had to change, and that change would come thanks to the philosopher John Locke. Locke said that God does not appoint the king with a blank check on power. Instead, God appoints kings with a mandate to protect man's natural rights. So long as a king defends man's rights, then his reign is sanctioned by God. But if he violates those rights, then he's no longer sanctioned, and the people have both the right and the obligation to overthrow him. This is not dissimilar from the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven and the heavenly cycle. In the case of the Glorious Revolution, Locke was saying that since James II was violating the English people's rights, his rule was no longer sanctioned by God. The English people were right to overthrow him. But, since William III and Mary II would defend their natural rights, their reign was sanctioned by God, and the people could not righteously overthrow them. This is classical liberalism, an ideology that would develop in interesting directions in the coming centuries. But before we find out how, we need to talk about our sponsor, Nations and Cannons, The American Crisis, which is on Kickstarter right now. Let me tell you, few things are more libertarian than overthrowing tyrannical governments, and in The American Crisis, you'll get to do exactly that. American Crisis is an expansion to the much-beloved Nations and Cannons supplement to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that transforms the swords and sorcery world of D&D into a historically accurate recreation of the American Revolution. The American Crisis, War in the North expands on that winning formula with even more features, including new character options for morale-boosting drummers and sharpshooting Jaegers, advanced flintlock firearms like the Amuset, Swivel Breech Rifle, Lorenzoni Musket, and other more exotic black powder weapons, and historically accurate atlases featuring annotated maps of New York, Boston, Valley Forge, Philadelphia, and other key locations from the Revolutionary War, all of which are based on period watercolors made by actual military surveyors from the Revolution. The American Crisis also comes with a full campaign, where you'll explore key moments from the Revolutionary War with playable characters pulled straight from the pages of history. During that campaign, you'll get to pilot the world's first combat submarine in occupied New York, join George Washington at the crossing of the Delaware, fight alongside Benedict Arnold at the Battle of Saratoga, and endure cold, starvation, and espionage at Valley Forge. Remember that this Kickstarter is only available for a limited time, so act fast and use my exclusive code Ezekiel in your Kickstarter survey or at the Nations and Cannons web store for a free PDF of the Nations and Cannons core rulebook. And if you miss the Kickstarter, don't worry, you can still check all of this out at nationsandcannons.com. Thank you, Nations and Cannons, for sponsoring this video. The coming centuries would see the rise of republics in France and the Americas. It was these republics that would see the transition away from classical liberalism and towards modern liberalism. The core ideological change here was that modern liberalism was less interested in natural rights and more interested in human rights. That distinction is important. Natural rights are those which man has in nature, and in the absence of a society or state, the idea being that neither government nor society should infringe on man's natural conditions any more than necessary. Natural rights are objective and hierarchical. It's not difficult to figure out what man can and can't do in a state of nature. And since the natural world is hierarchical and competitive, so too are societies based on its laws. Human rights, however, are things to which you are entitled just by being human. This is far more subjective and inherently egalitarian. After all, every human is just as human as every other, so is entitled to the same rights. But what are those rights? Unlike with natural rights, you can't just look out the window and find out. Luckily, human rights' egalitarianism provides the solution. Only a democracy with a broad franchise could possibly meet the egalitarian requirements of human rights, so why not just let people vote on their rights? That way, whatever those rights may be, everyone will have them equally, and if there's ever a problem, they can just vote for new rights. In practice, modern liberalism was characterized by skepticism of hierarchies like religion and monarchy, while it supported democracy and the welfare state. Thomas Paine is an excellent example of the transition from classical to modern liberalism. In his Common Sense, Paine viciously attacks the idea of monarchy and supports the creation of an independent American republic, while in Rights of Man, he makes a similar but slightly less radical argument in favor of the French Revolution, one that's not altogether hostile to monarchy, but does include a major section advocating for social welfare and mass education programs. The next and final form of liberalism is the kind that most of us live under today: neoliberalism. Neoliberalism began to take shape in the decades leading up to the World Wars, and was fully realized by the end of World War II. Neoliberal society is very different from the kind John Locke envisioned with kings and natural rights. Neoliberalism is republican, highly democratic, and totally replaces natural rights with human rights. Neoliberal societies are also either secular or outright atheistic. But the thing is, as much as some wish it did, history did not end with neoliberalism. Many liberal states tried to go further, and that put the liberals in an awkward position. The process we've seen play out here is one where liberal thought moves away from natural rights and monarchy and towards a system of human rights and democracy. This was the natural and inevitable conclusion of following liberalism's initial premises to their conclusion. Liberalism was never primarily interested in natural rights, it was primarily interested in justifying its state. Remember, Locke already liked his new monarchs and their government, he just wanted to legitimize them. For most of its history, liberalism championed the expansion of the state, with the only real limit being liberalism's love of property. But once that limit to state power was met, the state's only remaining path to expansion was by transitioning into a new order like socialism or fascism, which is exactly what it tried to do. The states that liberals once championed were now trying to escape their grasp. Some even succeeded. Now, the only way the liberals could maintain or regain their control was by fighting against or even reversing the historical process that they once led. All of a sudden, the liberals found themselves in bed with the political right. This is why socialists have been accusing the liberals of being reactionary for more than a century. And you know what? They're right. With the state at or beyond its liberal limits, only reactionary politics can keep the liberals in control. Now, it's not an original critique of reactionaries to point out that past conditions are what led to present ones, so any successful reaction would only recreate the conditions that led to the very present they're trying to abolish. This critique is what finally allows us to talk about libertarianism. Before they had their ideology, proto-libertarians believed themselves to be some kind of liberal. After all, didn't liberals also believe in natural rights? But what the libertarians missed is that the liberal support for natural rights was only secondary to their primary belief in the state. That is the key philosophical difference between libertarianism and liberalism. Liberalism places the state first and believes in natural rights, human rights, democracy, or whatever else only second and insofar as it legitimizes their state. Libertarianism is the opposite. It believes in natural rights first, and only tolerates the state insofar as it does not infringe on those rights. Some libertarians even go as far as to believe that the state is, inherently, a violation of natural rights, and calls for its complete abolition. This helps explain why much of libertarianism is so influenced by anti-liberal and usually anarchist thinkers like Lysander Spooner. Because libertarians are not fighting to defend or reform the liberal democratic order of the last 300 years. They're fighting to end it. So if liberals are reactionaries, what does that make the libertarians? Well, before we can get into that, I need to say something that will upset both libertarians and their enemies. Real libertarianism has never been tried. Libertarians may LARP and say that medieval Iceland, Ireland, or random cities in Renaissance Italy or Germany were libertarian. But that's silly. I doubt that any libertarian is genuinely trying to turn their society into medieval Iceland or a province of the Holy Roman Empire. The early United States was not libertarian either. It was just radically liberal, as is evidenced by the fact that the only thing the American state ever did was expand. Even the Constitution, that supposed limiter of federal power, never successfully limited the American government. In fact, the Constitution itself increased the size of the federal government by replacing the more restrictive Articles of Confederation that came before it. The claim that the Constitution did, or was even supposed to limit the power of the American government is highly suspect. Libertarianism's enemies, meanwhile, like to cite Russia right after the collapse of the Soviet Union as an example of a failed attempt at libertarianism. But I'm highly skeptical of that claim too. Personally, I feel like a totalitarian command economy existing mere moments before the creation of this supposed libertarian paradise may have rigged the situation at least a little bit. I mean, it's not like the people who were planning the economy before ended up owning all of the assets after privatization or anything. So if it's true that libertarianism has never been realized, then that means there's another interesting difference between it and liberalism. Since liberals are trying to maintain current conditions or revert back to previous ones, they're reactionaries. But libertarians are trying to create something completely new. So in spite of being on the political right, libertarians are not reactionaries. They are that rarest of political breeds, right-wing revolutionaries. Libertarians have a fundamentally right-wing view of the world. One could even say that they reject the liberal and leftist belief in the equality of man. From both the leftist and liberal perspective, if man is equal and a free society results in unequal outcomes, then some injustice must have occurred. It follows then that the state will have some obligation to equalize its subjects to bring them back to their equal natures. But to libertarians, this forced equality looks like a violation of natural rights. When a libertarian looks at the natural world, he sees individuals within the same species as unequal and able to organize themselves into hierarchies. So if that's true, from the libertarian perspective, the belief in equality will always lead to communism and slavery, because equal beings do not need to be free. An equal man would be miserable in a state of freedom, torn between the contradiction of his equal nature and unequal conditions. To libertarians, freedom is only possible and always necessary to man if he is an unequal being. In other words, if man is unequal, he must be free, and man can only be free because he is unequal. Even libertarianism's supposedly left-wing positions are the result of right-wing thought. Sure, libertarians want to decriminalize vices, including hard drugs and prostitution, but that isn't because they're bleeding hearts trying to protect libertines, or atheists trying to rebel against God. Libertarians just think that those people have the right to destroy themselves, and feel no obligation to intervene. This is unlike the liberal state, whose ability to legalize vice is limited. The liberal state's welfare systems means that it will bear the cost of a population full of alcoholics, drug addicts, mental and physical incompetence, and other kinds of dependence. This forces the liberal state to try and stop its people from becoming dependents in the first place. The liberal state can allow some vices, but no more than it can pay the negative consequences for. That is the force preventing a liberal society from becoming totally free. Libertarianism, on the other hand, doesn't have this problem, because it's opposed to using the state to take care of its citizens. In the absence of state welfare systems, a libertarian society can be totally free from all restraints on vices. As far as the libertarians are concerned, the question of self-destructive dependence will sort itself out. Those who can responsibly use vices will enjoy them, while those who can't won't remain a problem for long. A libertarian society is set up so there are no barriers to individuals realizing their potential. If an individual's potential is constructive, then they will succeed, and others capable of following their example will succeed too. But if an individual's potential is self-destructive, then they will be allowed to meet their fate. Libertarianism takes a Darwinian, natural rights approach to its right-wing interest of limiting social degeneracy and maximizing upwards potential. So in spite of some appearances, libertarianism is a fundamentally right-wing ideology. It may sometimes ally itself with the social left, but libertarianism does not do this because it supports self-destructive lifestyles. Libertarianism simply believes that in the absence of state intervention, social issues will sort themselves out. So let's sum all of this up. The key differences between liberalism and libertarianism are that liberalism prioritizes the state over natural rights, or may not believe in natural rights at all. Meanwhile, libertarianism always believes in natural rights, and always prioritizes them over the state. Under current political conditions, liberalism is a reactionary ideology aligned with the political right, while libertarianism is a revolutionary ideology. That, while fundamentally right-wing, is also anti-liberal, and because of that, is very much capable of cooperating with the political left. And that's libertarianism versus liberalism. This video was funded by a secret camarilla of radical libertarians as a part of their quest to end the global liberal democratic order and replace it with their own market anarchist order, including Handsome AJ and Josiah. And by this video's sponsor, the American Crisis War in the North, which is on Kickstarter right now. Be sure to use my exclusive code Ezekiel in your Kickstarter survey, or at the Nations and Canons web store for a free PDF of the Nations and Canons core rulebook. Links to them and where you can support us directly are in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.